Shivan, stay with us. Important that you mentioned that Iran has time and again hinted that it is looking for a permanent solution. It wants the end of this war, because this is something that's been mentioned by President Trump as well in the post that he's put out. He says that a resolution could be very much near. But talk to us about whether any statement has come in from the Iranian side so far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned, because a US official who's been quoted by NYT says that American military strikes against Iran have stopped in accordance with a 2-week ceasefire. In fact, White House official statement also coming in who says that Iran's ceasefire will come into force when Iran opens that Strait of Hormuz. So far, we've not heard any statement as such from the Iranian side regarding reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Samiksha, this was essentially which came a few minutes ago, ceasefire deal seen as a victory in Iran. There are two reactions that have come up right now. One is from the national television in Iran saying that the US President Donald Trump has accepted Iran's 10-point demand, and that is a victory for the country. Also, they have a statement that has come in from the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, signaling a positive response and also talking about a win for Iran. So it's customary. Both sides are going to go back saying they won. But this is what we're picking up from the Iranian side. To get a better perspective, I'll quickly cut over to Susan, our colleague who's joining us from New York. Susan, we've been discussing this. Take us through the nuances of how this has led to so far and the reactions you've picked up.
Right. So as you just mentioned, Siobhan, we are getting a statement on behalf of the Supreme National Security Council of the Islamic Republic. This is signed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abbas Araghchi, which quotes in part that if attacks against Iran are halted, our powerful armed forces will cease their defensive operations. For a period of 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. So it appears that Iran is on the same page now as the United States. But a lot happened in the last couple of hours, as you mentioned. And, I think looking at President Trump's statement, he was essentially turning the Strait of Hormuz into this bargaining chip. So were the Iranians, saying that if Iran reopens the world's most important oil route, then Washington pauses the bombing for 2 weeks and diplomacy gets a chance. If not, then the threat of major escalation is still very much on the table. But I think it's also important to note that while Iran has agreed, and we'll see if the Strait opens, we are already seeing the repercussions in the oil markets. I mean, prices are dropping just by the minute, and it's now below the 3 figures that it was just a couple of hours ago. So the markets are reacting favorably. But it's also important to note that, this is just so fragile at this point, and the threat of major escalation is still very much on the table. But it does appear that the president wanted to give these negotiations a chance. Really, instability in Hormuz was rippling through economies in many ways that people were not ready to absorb, even here in the United States, with gas prices being high on the one hand and the risk of escalation and more U.S. troops, possibly even ground troops going to Iran on the other. The president saw that this is a good opportunity for, as some would call it, an off-ramp. Others would say that he's trying to give negotiations a chance. So very interesting developments. But let's see what happens on the ground.
Yeah, Susan, also the 10-point plan that Trump had said that it's workable. I think in the next 2 weeks, they'll be able to achieve a lot of it. Very quickly, if I go over, Iran wanted an end to all attacks. Okay, we are going to look at a 2-week pause. Then they wanted full sanctions relief, whether US agrees to that or not, knowing that it was Trump's administration, Trump 1.0, which walked out of the JCPOA and sanctions came back, and then a halt to all Israeli strikes. They want reconstruction support and reparations, something they had mentioned earlier as well. Secure the Hormuz shipping lane, a $2 million fee per ship. There is a lot in those demands. No more attacks on Iranian allies. Of course, the US does not see them as any kind of ally. They consider them terrorist proxies, and along with them, money to rebuild the country. They've been mentioning reparations since a while. How much of this do you feel is actually workable, regardless of how long the ceasefire lasts?
Yeah, that's the thing. You look at these countering plans, and they're just from the very beginning and until today, nothing has changed. It just doesn't seem like the two sides are any closer to reaching any kind of agreement. But I will say that if Tehran signals this willingness to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and the pause in military escalations, and then the issue of Iran's uranium, enriched uranium that it has, and the nuclear issue gets resolved, I think there is a path forward. Those things about repatriation that Iran is calling for and the full sanctions relief, I think those are geared towards a domestic audience. It's very hard to imagine that the United States would accept that at this point in time. But there may be, an off-ramp for both sides. But it's very hard to imagine that the United States would pack up and leave knowing that Iran still has the enriched uranium that it has, up to 60% underground in its bunkers, even if, for example, the Strait of Hormuz is open. I think that's something that the Trump administration is hyper-focused on. Now, how they're going to be able to get that, a lot can happen. Whether it's going to be by force, it's hard to imagine Iran would just hand it over kindly in a silver platter to the United States. But those are issues that are very, very hard, and the devil's really in the detail.
I'll quickly take over a few more updates, Susan. Iran has, of course, agreed to the pause. Arakji gave out that statement, which Susan just took us through. He's also said that the safe transit in the Strait of Hormuz will be possible for 2 weeks via coordination with Iranian armed forces. There are more updates to that. Negotiations with the US will be held in Islamabad to finalize the details. And Iran says that talks will begin Friday, that is April 10th, and may be extended if both sides agree. So these are statements now coming in from Iran. As far as the US is concerned, they've already mentioned that they are going to be pausing for 2 weeks. Trump has acknowledged that 10-point plan, that yes, we've received it and it seems workable. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, they'll be able to really figure out how much of it they can abide to. As far as Iran's demands are concerned, that is an exhaustive 10-point plan. And most of those points are the contentious points so far, which have led to where we are as of now. How much of that is workable in the matter of just 2 weeks, what could not have been achieved in the last so many years, that will need to be seen. But Susan, I think we can all agree that both sides really wanted an off-ramp from this. Iran, for the sheer number of hits they were taking on a daily basis and the casualty rate, the fatalities that they are seeing, the civilian infrastructure which was getting damaged, and power plants which were very much on the radar, human chains being formed around power plants, just gave out how desperate Iran would have been to ensure that this is not damaged. It's clearly a lifeline for them. And as far as the US is concerned, it was definitely, it was clear that they could not have exited without opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Last week, the White House had said that it's not an objective for us. Donald Trump had asked any country that needs oil from the Strait of Hormuz, go and get it. It's not our problem. And then just a little over 24 hours ago, in that press conference, Donald Trump said it's a top priority for the US to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is secure. So at this point, I think both sides really needed this to stop. This has perhaps been the way that they're both attributing it to a third country and getting out. But these next 2 weeks, Susan, I don't think it ends. Do you agree? Because tensions are going to be high regarding what is achieved. If nothing significant is achieved in these next 2 weeks, you really don't know how long this ceasefire is going to last.
Well, yeah, that, and also the realities on the ground, really. We have reports that Israel has also agreed to halt bombing in Iran for these 2 weeks. But then you have the issue of Israel and Lebanon that plays into what's happening with Iran as well. There hasn't really been any kind of negotiation regarding that. And Hezbollah forces are backed by Iran in Lebanon. So they're tied together. And then you have the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of things can happen over there. It's surrounded by U.S. forces, but it's also heavily, possibly, with mines that the Iranians have set out as well. And one single gaffe from either side can really just put the ceasefire into shambles, and the war could start in a matter of 48 hours again. So it's not a guarantee that this 2 weeks is going to last, although completely agree with you that the two sides really were looking for an off-ramp, and perhaps just bringing in a third-party country was the best way for both of them. Although there have been reports that China also stepped in to try to convince the Iranians to open the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah,
At this point, it wasn't just Pakistan.
Yeah, that's something even I just read. There are reports, I think some Iranian officials have mentioned this to the New York Times, that China also had a role to play. It wasn't just, I mean, there has been a lot of effort which has gone in to get the Iranians to agree, because at every point Iran said no, regardless of how many hits they're taking and the damage they're taking and the amount of blood they're losing, they are going to continue. In fact, if you just go over less than 12 hours ago, there was a post from the Iranian president mentioning 14 million Iranians are ready to give up their lives for securing Iran, and that included himself. How do you even go to war with a country where the president is giving out this kind of a statement, in spite and rather despite all the attacks that they were taking on a daily basis? Tehran got bombed quite badly yesterday, and Iran were still continuing with the fight. As the Israeli onslaught and the US onslaught continued over Tehran, there were sirens blaring in Israel as they were intercepting missiles coming in from the Iranian side. There were remnants of those missiles falling in Damascus. Reports were suggesting all of that. All the Gulf countries, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, on a daily basis they were intercepting missiles. But Susan, given the fact that none of the Gulf countries actually got involved in this, they lasted there, they were able to just persevere for over nearly 6 weeks, 6 full weeks. It's really remarkable that they ensured that they don't get involved.
Yes, despite the fact that there were statements by Saudi Arabia and the UAE explicitly saying that they would get involved any day now if Iran continued its attacks against them. But they tried to sort of just intercept the Iranian attacks that were coming from them. And then, a lot of them were also these cluster munitions that Iran was sending into not only Israel, but also it was flying over these countries, and they got the brunt of it as well on their civilian infrastructure. So it really, again, it's such a fragile ceasefire right now, and anything could happen. But I think as far as the United States is concerned, it was not only concerned about the Strait of Hormuz because of its allies in the region, but also and oil prices and gas prices here. But also we have to take into consideration that the Strait of Hormuz also transfers a great deal of fertilizer as well. And these Gulf countries that you mentioned, Siobhan, they rely on those fertilizers for their crops. The international community relies on those fertilizers for their crops. So that was also a point that I think the Trump administration was really looking at, not only because of its allies, but also it would, despite the fact that the United States and farmers, they have their quota of fertilizers, it was going to, again, hit Americans with the cost of living. And that's something that the Trump administration is trying to mitigate as much as possible. So the American public opinion, very important in President Trump's decision right now, even if it's a pause, sort of like a breather. If there is going to be a negotiated settlement, ultimately we'll have to wait and see. But for the Iranians that have been hammered, and for the president who was fighting an unpopular war, this was the best case scenario right now.
Susan, also the Israelis, will they get reined in? Because, and this is something we were discussing just before we went live, that there were reports that Iran launched a new wave of missiles towards Israel. This was just 10 minutes after Donald Trump had put out that post and announcing that 2-week ceasefire. This is what the IDF has said. So will the Israelis get reined in? Because and Iran towards Israel, in fact, it's both sides. If that aspect of the war does not stop, how effective is this ceasefire even?
Yeah, that's very true. And again, through statements of the media, we're hearing that the Israelis have apparently also agreed to stop the bombing campaign. I didn't see anything from the Iranians saying that they would stop their attacks against Israel in those statements. And also, again, I can't raise the importance of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the fighting that's ongoing between Israel and them right now. That is a huge aspect of the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran, because Hezbollah is funded by the Islamic Republic. So will they continue with their proxies and then Israel has to, have a little war with the proxies on that side, or is that going to stop as well? So that's a huge question. And again, when you're fighting an Iranian proxy, it's very hard for the United States not to once again get involved and get dragged into the region because of Israel, and also, just the fire that goes around the Middle East, if Hezbollah attacks, another neighboring country, and then it's a U.S. ally. It's close to a U.S. base. So a lot of these things could happen. You're absolutely right.
All right, Susan, thanks so much. There will be more to discuss. We'll come right back to you. And for now, that's a wrap from Samiksha and my side. We'll take a very short break. Stay with us. Lots more to track.